She is working on a fascinating project at the University of Newcastle and has kindly agreed to come along and share some of the, well, preliminary findings or...
Yes, very much work in progress.
Yeah, work in progress with us today. Thank you, Abbi.
Thanks. Thank you all. I'm a research associate at Newcastle University and I'm here to talk about connections between singing traditional songs and people spending time together on paths and trails. I should say as a caveat, I'm an archaeologist, historian and poet, so this is a new area of research for me. It's an unexpected part of a research project that I'm working on that just started to spark my interest, so I'm really keen to hear from people in the room about how it connects to your experiences and your work as well. So this is the project that I'm working on at the moment. It's an Arts and Humanities Research Council funded project that explores the post-war history, development and experiences of public rights of way in England and Wales. So by rights of way for the project, we're looking at those paths and trails that have a formal legal designation that means they're protected for us to enjoy, but today I'm going to talk more generally about paths and trails. The project is a partnership between Oxford Brookes University and Newcastle University. It's led by Professor Glenn O'Hara at Brookes and Claire Hickman at Newcastle, and it takes an interdisciplinary approach but very much rooted in history. So the part of the project that I'm working on, I'd say, is the fun social bits that I get to talk to people about the different ways that people are engaging with rights of ways, the different ways they spend time on them, what they're doing on them, and what those paths and trails mean to them. So a day, I think it was last year, Claire and I were in the wonderful Co-operative Heritage Trust archive looking for references relating to paths and trails and people being on paths. And we found a selection of several songbooks that seemed to be particularly designed for people to sing outside in the open air on paths and trails by people on Co-operative Holiday Association and Holiday Fellowship holidays. So this really piqued our interest because the countryside, when you think about people going out to spend time in the countryside, it's often portrayed as a very peaceful place, that you go out to enjoy the sounds of nature and be away from too many people, be away from the cities and towns. And then we found this archival material that suggests that people are going out there in big groups and being quite noisy and singing along paths and trails. This was really interesting. And then later in the year, I was in the Sheffield City archives and found another songbook with the rather directive title, Songs for Ramblers to Sing on Moorlands. So all these songbooks that we found were from organisations that were part of the growing outdoor recreation movement in the early 20th century. Songs for Ramblers was put together by G.H.B. Ward, which, if you're interested in the outdoors in Sheffield, you may have heard of. He was the founder of the Sheffield Clarion Ramblers and a big campaigner for access onto moorlands and the countryside in general. The other songbooks were published by the Co-operative Holiday Association and Holiday Fellowship, which provided accessible and affordable outdoor holidays. They were founded by the Congregational Minister T.A. Leonard, a pioneer of open-air holidays. And all of the organisations were kind of part of a broader movement that was about initially targeting people at urban working folk in the industrial centres of the north, but aiming to foster personal and social and sometimes moral transformation and improvement through encouraging people to spend their leisure time in meaningful ways, so connecting with nature and democratising access to the countryside. And they also blended enriching and educational activities in what they offered. So if you went on a Co-operative Holiday Association holiday at the start of the 20th century, you'd be expected to go on compulsory rambles, where there would be wayside talks on history, literature, nature and other social issues. And in the annual handbooks for the Sheffield Clarion Ramblers, Ward said that every ramble should have a talk or a reading or a song as part of it, and he included words for these within the annual handbooks for the walking group. So across these groups, collective singing was part of this enriching and educational repertoire, and they produced songbooks to facilitate this. These were sold to members. So sometimes these include music and words, sometimes the music and words were sold separately. Sometimes the songbooks were embedded in the programme of holidays for the year, so they were really integrated into how people saw they should be spending their time in the countryside. Now, they're not unique in this. Other groups around the same time, such as the Rucksack Club and the Woodcraft Folk, produce songbooks. But what we thought was particularly distinctive about these is they're meant to be sung outside, on paths and in the landscape. So I'm going to focus mainly on those archival songbooks today, but just want to say that obviously singing outdoors isn't confined to the early 20th century. It's something that's continuing. It's a living practice. So as part of the research for the project, alongside looking at archival material, I'm also going out and interviewing people who are engaging with public rights-of-ways in different ways, using them on different modes of travel or in different ways. And as part of this, I've interviewed a choir that uses walking as part of its repertoire, so they walk and sing outdoors as part of their choir practice. And then I'm also looking at existing oral history collections. So one in particular that I've looked at in relation to the area around here is More Memories, which was an oral history project 2010 to 12 that was a partnership between the Moors for the Future Partnership and the Peak District National Park, and there's some lovely examples of people singing the paths and ways in there as well. So it's very much work in progress that I'm going to talk about today. So, to start with, where were people singing? So as I said, all the songbooks were talking about singing outdoors, and that's not just in the titles of the songbooks, Song by the Way, songs for ramblers to sing on moorlands, but also in the introductory text to these songbooks. It really lays out that these were songs that people were singing on moorland, hillslope and summit. Songs were selected because they were suitable for singing in the open air. But just as the quotes on the side say, they were sung in other places as well. So they became part of the culture of these groups, if you like. The songs were sung when they stopped at pubs. They were sung when they were waiting for the bus or on the train home. They were sung at club social events for the Sheffield Clarion Ramblers and within the holiday centres for the Co-operative Holiday Association and Holiday Fellowship. As Linda Crawley, who was interviewed in the More Memories project, says about her experiences with woodcraft folk, we sang on the moors, we sang on the bus, we sang when we were having our lunch. We were like the Von Trapp family singers sometimes. And there's this lovely individual quote as well from Bill Amingham from that about how these songbooks had a life beyond their original intention for formal organised group singing. That this chap, when he was interviewed in the 2010s, is still talking about taking the songbooks with him, in this case the Woodcraft Folk one, but stopping after his sandwiches when he's had a walk and singing or reading one of the songs. So it's become part of a personal practice, if you like. So in publishing the songbooks, I think what the organisations enabled was for these songs to have a bit of a life of their own, beyond the organised singing as well. So what kind of songs that we're singing, which might be, I guess, of interest to this group. So I found several of the songbooks and collated the songs into a spreadsheet to try and look at what kind of songs they were singing. Unsurprisingly, there's a lot of overlap. So there are a number of iterations of the Co-operative Holiday and Holiday Fellowship songbooks, and so there's a lot of songs that appear in multiple iterations of those. All of them would have included songs that were popular in the early 20th century, because that's what they were targeting those members at that time. Distinctively, the Co-operative Holiday and Holiday Fellowship songbooks have a substantial selection of hymns as well, which I think reflects their Christian ethos and foundation, really. The majority of the songs are what I would think of, and I will be guided by people with greater expertise than me in the room, as traditional or folk songs, though. And many of these have a connection with landscape and nature. As Ward puts it in the introduction for Songs to Ramblers, what better medium could we desire than the old English country folk song with its simple appeal and the very breath of the countryside in its jingling rhymes. So there's that real connection between the outdoors and folk and traditional music. So there's folk songs from various parts of England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales and America. Sea shanties are included. Some of these have a call and response or a sort of repeated chorus section, or there's rounds, so clearly with designs on collective and group singing. There are a small selection of popular comic songs, and in some books a number of songs that were made famous to blackface minstrelsy. But overall there's this emphasis on folk song and a sense that this is the music that resonates most with the English landscape, and perhaps see this as part of the early 20th century folk revival as a whole as well. But it's also a sense of a growing collective tradition. The songs that have been collected, the middle quote there talks about some of the songs have been included because people were already singing them out in the landscape. So this is sort of telling people what songs are appropriate to sing in the landscape, but also taking from what people were already doing in the landscape. For the walking choir that I joined, there was an emphasis on the folk tradition as well, although incorporating a wider range of traditional songs. So they had songs from other countries and other cultures in other languages, and newly written songs that had a political angle. So when I joined them, they sang a song called Safe Harbour about welcoming refugees, for example. And on the walk itself, with the walking choir, the choice of song was often in conversation with the environment and quite spontaneous and joyful. So by a river, they stopped to sing a song called I Am a River, and under a lime tree, they sang a Slovenian folk song about lime tree. And then later on, where we stopped in an open field, there were swallows swirling ahead. And so the choir leader taught everybody a new round about birds. So there was this quite nice connection with the environment in terms of song choice. Ooh. Oh dear. Oh, apologies, that's not a very helpful slide. But yeah, it's not actually showing the text in the slides, which it was when I sent it on, unfortunately. So what you can't see here is that what's caught my eye, I'll move back to the next slide because that's not very nice to look at, were a number of songs that were rewritten. So particularly in the Sheffield Clarion Ramblers songbook, there were revisions of existing folk songs with lyrics that were about the Derbyshire countryside, that were about members of the Sheffield Clarion Ramblers group. So, for example, Ward rewrote the Lincolnshire Poacher, or rewrote new words for it to that tune, called The Trespasser's Song, which I'll read some of the lyrics because we couldn't see them on the screen. So one of the verses now goes, "There is no keeper in the peak whom I could not lose, and if he'd watched me for a week, I'd tread the moor I chose. But soon the moorlands will be free, my friend a shepherd be. And then, when we meet on the hill, we'll sing these words with glee. Oh, 'tis our delight, be it storm or bright, to wander everywhere." So this was published in 1922, I think, the Songs for Ramblers. So this is before there was very much access to the countryside in Derbyshire at all. So you can see that there's kind of a political angle to these songs as well. The rewrites were in a much less extent in the Co-operative Holiday and the Holiday Fellowship books, but they did have a couple. There was a song called Adieu that was rewritten to the tune of There's a Tavern in the Town, about returning home from holiday and remembering lovely times in the countryside walking. So I'm really interested into how this might connect with older traditions of remaking songs to popular tunes, and would really be interested in hearing what people think about that. So we saw that with Ward's Trespasser's Song, that there was a political aspect, and the choice of songs to sing on paths can be political as well, especially in relation to activism and campaigns for greater access to the countryside. So there was singing on the Kinder and other trespassers in the early 20th century. Oral history accounts report them singing socialist and bolshy songs and outdoor songs. And of course, some of those marches were attended by the then Jimmy Miller, who went on to write the Manchester Rambler as Ewan MacColl, which was then sung at the 90th anniversary of the Kinder Trespass in Hayfield last year. So there's a nice sort of connection around time in that singing. In the more memories, oral history, there are examples of both individual and group singing as a form of protest. So very informally, the quote on the slide here from Linda Corley talks about singing the Manchester Rambler as they walk through farmland to kind of get up the noses of the farmers a little bit about access to the countryside. And this continues up to the present day. So the Leeds-based Commoners Choir, led by Boch Worley, have used singing as a form of embodied and place-based activism. Group singing has been part of peaceful trespassers by the contemporary Right to Roam movement. So singing has multiple places in the history of access to the countryside. So I just want to come back to this idea of social singing, because certainly for the archival songbooks that I was looking at, group singing was framed by the organisations who published these as a way of promoting good fellowship. Collective singing brought people together, was a way of building community. So Ward's quote here also suggests that this is a fellowship with more than just people. We're joining in with the full-throated, joyous song of the birds in his idea of fellowship. So we're building fellowship with nature as well through the kind of songs that we're singing. And there's lots of examples of this in the oral histories and my own experience of the walking interviews that I've conducted as well, where people talk about the responses of livestock when they've been out singing in the landscape. And sometimes these are very funny, sometimes a little bit scary. But this fellowship might not be open to everybody. It can exclude as well as include. So if you weren't Christian, you might not have felt that comfortable singing the hymns that were part of the Co-operative Holiday Songbooks repertoire. If you were new to the Sheffield Clarion Ramblers, I imagine some of those in-jokes in the rewritten songs might not land as well as they're intended to be. And the inclusion of songs made popular through blackface minstrelsy may have reflected the popularity of these songs at the time, but we now understand that these perpetuate harmful stereotypes of blackness, and they need to be seen in the context of wider discussions about the history and the marginalisation of people from BME backgrounds in the countryside and from outdoor pursuits. So singing songs from the archival songbooks could be seen as an expression of connection with one another, a connection with God, a connection with nature, with the other than human, and it could be a political and provocative act. It could serve to build fellowship and include, or marginalise and exclude. I just want to finish with something that my colleague Claire found when she was doing archival research in the British Library earlier this year, that speaks to the idea of this idea that the songbooks were giving you appropriate songs to sing in the landscape. But actually, it wasn't just what you were singing, it was the way that you sung it that was appropriate to sing in the landscape. So looking through back issues of Comradeship, which is the magazine of the Co-operative Holiday Association, Claire found these lovely letters that show that even when people are singing in the right place, they might be singing in the wrong way and the wrong songs. So in 1910, the founder of the movement, T.A. Leonard, writes in to complain about a rowdy way of singing and the noisiest, rollicking songs that are currently popular in their holiday centres. One of the aims of the Co-operative Holiday Association was to offer an alternative to what Leonard saw as inane and trivial holidays spent at seaside at places like Blackpool, but not, and I quote, at the expense of bringing the Blackpool spirit and the Blackpool noise into the countryside. So here he complains that McNamara's band was being yelled morning, noon and night, indoors and out, among the silent hills by day and along country lanes at night, to the exasperation of quiet folk until all but the noise lovers were tired out. And the debate continues. So in 1912, a younger member of the Co-operative Holiday Association writes in to complain that Leonard's attitude is repressing the desire of people to be natural. This member writes in defence of the hilarity and breeziness that should be the possession of noble-minded youth. And this kind of singing to celebrate achievements in nature shouldn't be confused with uncontrolled rowdyism. Ward too writes about rowdyism in the pages of the Sheffield Clarion Ramblers handbooks, but he seems to see this more to do with vandalism and physical rowdyism rather than songs and singing. And in fact, he encourages to raise our voices so that their echoes may resound from Pendle Hill to Kinder Scout. So I think what interested us in terms of our project was how the types of songs people were singing, where they were singing them, and what they were, who was singing them, were drawn into debates about expected ways of being in the landscape. It's not just what was being sung, with traditional songs favoured, but how these were sung. So in effect, the songbooks were kind of controlling what was seen as being appropriate songs to be singing outdoors. And it kind of lends a further layer of complexity to the ideas of relationships between singing, sociality, and the outdoors. So this is sort of one of the questions we're wrestling with now, is in which ways do group singing and being on paths and ways connect? And what songs and music are welcome in the landscape, which less so, and what does this tell us about ideas about how to behave in the countryside, how to be in the countryside? Who does this welcome and who does this marginalise? You can find out more about our project here, and there's a website there, and I've also got some little postcards with the website address on, so you don't have to write it down if you don't want to. The archive's a very quiet place, but these songbooks were never meant to be silent. So one of the things we're doing next in November is we're working with the Ousbourne Folk Choir led by Janice Burns on an event in Newcastle, which is going to perform some of these traditional songs from the songbooks live, and then blend that in with a little bit of research that Claire and I have been doing about how these songs were used, and share that in an event. So the publicity and the bookings for that go live next week, so if anybody's interested and you're based in the northeast, just give me a shout. As I said at the beginning, I'm not a traditional music specialist, so I'm really interested in your thoughts on what we've been finding out and what it might connect to in other areas of research in this field. And I just wanted to finish, if it works, with a blast of that song that offended T.A. Leonard so much, with people singing it. So this is, if it works, a little bit of McNamara's band.
My name is McNamara, I'm the leader of the land. Although we're small in numbers, we're the best men in the land. We play for wakes and weddings and at every fancy ball. And when we play a funeral, sure we play the marksman's all. All the bells go bang, the cymbals hang, the harmony plays away. The market plays the orchestra, my line the pipes will bang. Oh, Tennessee, tunes, the foot of the music is something grand. I play to do a lyre and the bang and the bar and bang.
So you can imagine that being hollered on the hillsides. Absolutely fantastic. Thank you.
What a great rousing ending to a paper. Thank you, Abby, so much.
Makes up for me not being able to sing.
Fascinating. Well, you've got us all joining in there. So we have time for questions, and so we can hear better, I'm going to ask you if you would repeat the question.
Sure.
Before you respond to it, if that's not too difficult. And we have one right up here.
Just to show that this actually does continue along, my wife belongs to a group of people who would normally be singing the Sheffield carols, but in fact ramble once each year from Maling Bridge, where they sing the song Maling Bridge, to Spout Cottage, where they sing the song Spout, to the tune of Spout Cottage, and so on and so forth around the Loxley Valley, stopping at the houses of people that they know. Unfortunately, it's presented a bit of a difficulty when it came to the song to the tune Egypt and Pentonville. But it is something that it's exactly as has been described, and anybody wants to come along, see me later. The other thing I would like to mention, I'm a little bit worried by your timescale, because the Ramblers movement, particularly Clarion Ramblers and whatever, were really turn of the century, and they were producing booklets at that time, little Clarion songbook booklets. I'm sure you've seen those. And when you said post-war, I assumed 1945 onwards.
So the project is, so that was a question about the timescale. So the project itself is looking at the post-war experience, development and uses of rights of way, but we are looking back a little bit further. So yes, we are looking at the early 20th century, because some of these continue. So on the first slide, the Songs of Faith, Nature and Fellowship was published in the 1950s, but that was drawing on these songbooks that were from the 1920s and things. And as you can see, like the guy who was interviewed in 2010 or 2012, he's still using these songbooks. So I think you're right, it's a little bit before our project is officially focused on, but these are things that are still being used in the landscape at the time that we're looking at.
They then become important because of people getting 5 day weeks, 6 day weeks, 5 day weeks,
Absolutely.
and which enables them to have free time. And also, of course, that the railways were developing, and it gave them a means of getting there. So, but all that happened before your 1945.
Yeah, so that our project really begins with the 1949 Act.
Okay,
And
I'll see you
what's
later.
happened since then. But yes, very happy to chat about that later. And my colleagues at Oxford Brookes University, so Glenn and Tom Breen, who's the postdoc there, they're doing a lot more work on the sort of ways that rights of way were registered. So how parish councils, the challenges that they've had in getting rights of way on the definitive map since then. So certainly that side of the project is not what I was really talking about today with the traditional song, but there is a lot of work going on around that.
Thanks, Dave. Question. I was thinking also about the rambling carols as well, and that synchronicity between the song and the place, that sort of matching process of somehow making that sort of place a bit more sacred almost by enhancing it with a song that was appropriate to the space.
Absolutely, and it actually, Paul's talk made me think about it as well, because in the walking choir that I spoke to, when we went and sang, and I asked them about why do you stop and sing at certain places, and sometimes it is that we've got a song about a river, so we're going to stop by a river. Other times they stopped under trees because the acoustics was better than singing in the open. And then another time it was entirely practical. We stopped in an open field because there was loads of midges out and there was a wind there, so we wouldn't get bitten when we stopped. So, and they love performing, the choir that I spoke to loved performing in caves because of the acoustics in the cave, and they've done some lovely concerts in caves and things like that. So yeah, it's not restricted to just paths and rights of way, that's just sort of a bit that we looked at. Sorry.
Sorry, there's a question here from John and then from yourself at the back, but John was in there first.
Well, it's just to sort of say the links to community singing and the early 20th century. As far as I know, that is not well researched. How did the 19th century, where public singing was a key part of many people's lives, not in community choir or community singing context, with things like penny reading, supper clubs, trade union meetings, Primrose meetings, all of these will be places where people would have their song that they would sing. And how that transitioned into what was community singing, which was how songs were described in the 1920s and the turn of the century. I don't know of much. I'd be interested if you know of anything published about that, because I don't think, as far as I know, anyone's really looked at that in detail, about how singing in public for ordinary people changed between the late 19th century and the early to mid 20th century.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So John was asking about the transition between public and community singing from the late 19th century into these sort of more organised, I guess, examples in the early 20th century that I've been looking at. And so, you know, this is an emerging bit of research for me in the project, so I've not had a chance to look at that kind of literature. I do know that some of the things, so say from the Clarion movement, they had, I think they're called Cinderella clubs, where they did things like singing. There was a lot of glee clubs and things like that, but I guess that's more the sort of formalised than the sort of emergent community singing that you're talking about. But perhaps there's people in the room who know more about that background than me.
There's a lot of potential precedents, I think, for that lead into that. Thank you. Just one more question up the back there.
My name is Alan Cox. A late friend of mine, Jimmy Allen from Runfer, took part in the mass trespass of King the Scout, and he was passionate about public rights of way. And even into his late 70s, when he was out walking, he took a pair of wire cutters with him. And he found a public right of way that was barbed right across. He used to cook them. Yeah, amazing man.
Was he singing?
And I think,
Was he singing when he did?
yeah, was he singing?
Probably Jocko Herschel did.
But I think that does speak to something in terms of the projects that I was talking about, someone cutting wires when they're just out for a ramble because they're passionate about access. And I think certainly for our project as a whole, that kind of everyday people who were contributing to the fights for access, and also that these footpaths are very much everyday footpaths. You know, we're not talking about the big national trails and the history of those in our project. We're very much thinking about those everyday important footpaths and bridleways and byways that we all use for lots of different reasons, not just for recreational ends, but we use for shortcuts, we use for work, we use to exercise, lots of things. So yeah, really important, those small histories. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abbi. That's been a fascinating talk. So it gives me great pleasure to ask Catherine Ann Cullen to come up. Catherine is visiting us all the way from Dublin, I think, where she's based as a researcher. And we'll just get your PowerPoint up here. Or,
Yeah.
yeah, it should be.
I also have it.
Yeah, it's just actually in there. So actually, I said to myself I wouldn't try and say the name of your paper because I'm not sure how to pronounce it. So I'm going to hand over to Catherine to say it for me.
Okay, I'll do that.
Are
now.
you okay? Just
get
in
the
it.
slideshow view here. Okay. So thank you, Julia. So my paper today is called "And Fakes, My Name is James E. Carney." Sorry, I better go over to the mic. Fakes, My Name is James E. Carney, raking through the archives for raping Pauline Rue. And I'd just like to preface my talk by saying I will use a word during the talk which is no longer an acceptable word to refer to Irish travellers. That is tinker, and I hope that will be accepted by all as being in the context of the archival documents. So my subject today is the elusive James Carney, who is an enigma of mid-19th century Dublin singing and songwriting. Carney was active in Dublin from the 1840s to 60s as a writer of ballads, a singer and comic and sometimes patriotic performer in what one anthologist called the inferior concert rooms of Dublin. He may have been a tinker in both senses of that word at the time, that is both a tinsmith and an Irish traveller. And he may have been discovered singing in his tenement tin shop and employed on the music saloon stage. Decide for yourself. There are just a few sources for Carney's songs and fewer for his performances. His songs were published both in single sheets and in several songbooks, most importantly Duffy's The Irish Comic Songster of 1845, which included 14 of Carney's songs. His performances I've mostly pieced together from ads and a small number of reviews and previews in the newspapers of the day. But for Carney's biographical details, there's only one main source, and that is P.J. McCall, who lived from 1861 till 1919. P.J. was a poet and songwriter, writing songs such as Boo the Vogue and Follow Me Up to Carlow, really great Irish songs. He was a ballad collector, a publican on Patrick Street, just opposite St. Patrick's Cathedral, right on the edge of the Liberties in Dublin and among the worst tenements there. He was a Dublin City Councillor, and he has 13 scrapbooks of Irish street songs held at the National Library of Ireland and copied at the Irish Traditional Music Archive, where I actually looked at them. And his father, John McCall, came from Carlow, was also a publican, poet, song collector and folklorist. So you would think P.J. McCall is well qualified to give us some details about Carney. So what did he tell us? So P.J. told us about Carney in kind of peripherally in two papers that he wrote. One is called In the Shadow of St. Patrick's, about the area around the cathedral, and one is on the Dublin street poet Zosimus, or Michael Moran, and his contemporaries. The Zosimus paper wasn't published till long after the death of McCall, but was probably written around the same time as the first piece, which was presented as a paper in 1893 and published as a small book in 1894. McCall's writing here about the cathedral area when he mentions Carney. Here to this Walker's Alley came a County Clare tinker, one James Carney, who settled there about 50 years since. Halliday Sparling, in his Irish minstrelsy, says that he wrote many of the songs sung by Carey and other music hall favourites, and that he died about 12 years ago. Now this is would be referring back then to about the early 1880s that they think Carney died. This first statement is not a fact, and though I rob a local celebrity of his laurels, I must in justice state that Carney never wrote a line in his life, for he was hopelessly illiterate. I have a collection of about 50 songs bearing his name as author, but these were all purchased by him from others, all Liberty men, that means from the area of the Liberties in Dublin, or natives of the district. And then he goes on to say, but at least as a wit and inimical mimic, the raking Pauline Rue, as Carney liked to call himself, is entitled to honourable mention. And his little book usefully contains a little map in the back, through which you can see, I think here, at these are slum streets that were going right up to the very, very edge of the cathedral. At the time, it's now a beautiful public park, and they were demolished at the end of the 19th century. As a town councillor, McCall was actually instrumental in having them demolished. And so you can see Walker's Alley runs along up to Goodman's Lane there, just at the bottom of the map, and that's where our James Carney is alleged to have had his tin shop. In the second piece, that's about the Dublin Street poet Zosimus, Carney writes a little bit about, McCall writes a little bit about Carney too. He says he first opened his tin shop in Walker's Alley, later St. Patrick's Place at the north side of the cathedral. There, while hammering away at his pots, kettles and pans, he would have a crowd of admirers round him attracted by his singing, or rather by his enunciation and byplay. In this way his fame went abroad. One evening, Lamass, a music hall proprietor in the city, paid a furtive visit to the alley and mingled with the audience. The result was that Carney was engaged to sing at his music hall on Inns Quay. Lamass afterwards removed to Capel Street to a hall built by McManus, a Belfast man. For years, Carney sang there, removing afterwards to Crampton Court, which he finally acquired, but he did not succeed very well as a music hall proprietor. So, to sum up what McCall tells us about Carney, he was a tinker from Clare and a tinsmith in Walker's Alley, talent spotted by a music hall owner called Lamass, sang on Inns Quay, which is by the Four Courts in Dublin, in Capel Street and later in Crampton Court. He acquired the latter music hall himself, but was not successful. He didn't write any songs because he was illiterate, and he died in Dublin, possibly in the early 1880s. So, does any of this hold up? With regard to the tin shop, there is one possible mention in the city courts in 1839 of a person stealing a tin can, the property of James Carney. We have no address or details here, but it was in the city centre, and could this be our Carney? The poor young fellow who took the can got 3 months in hard labour for it, so that sounded rough. Crampton Court is a very interesting little area in Dublin, just a little laneway really, but packed at one stage with tenement houses and taverns. And the Castle Tavern in Crampton Court was one of the early music saloons in Dublin, and one of several on this small court. Here's a page from Kilgallen's Almanac of 1847, which shows James Carney as a vintner. But if he was a tinsmith in 1839, and through the early 1840s, and proprietor by 1847, where are the intervening many years of singing for Lamass? Dublin hosted a great exhibition in 1853, which carried this is the guide to the exhibition, which carries an ad for the Castle Tavern, proprietor a Mr. Stewart. And it has this note at the bottom of the ad: Mr. J. Carney's songs may be had at the bar. I haven't seen ballads advertised this way before in Dublin, and it marks an interesting transition from the broadside ballads sold on the street to the move indoors to singing in pubs, music saloons and halls. But you can see here that Carney is no longer the proprietor of the Castle Tavern, or perhaps he's not the sole proprietor. Reports of Carney's performances in other premises come in ads like these ones for the poorer saloons of Dublin, and in roundups of what was on in the provincial theatres of Britain and Ireland. So there's just a little selection here from Prince Patrick's Theatre in April 1855, O'Connell's Theatre in October the 9th, that's also on Crampton Court, and, this is October the 9th, 1856, and it actually says this is Carney's first appearance there. So that's kind of interesting. He's moved from the place that he owned, perhaps, to another establishment. And the Monster Saloon in 1862, March. And the very last mention of Carney is the one from August 1862, which is the Monster Saloon, Crampton Court, off Dame Street, the splendid hall, and down at the bottom, continued approbation of Mr. James Carney, comic singer and author. So that's the last we hear of Carney in the newspapers and in his performances. But there are mentions of him around that year, earlier that year, as a pantomime writer and singer, which I thought was very interesting to find him in a theatrical paper of 1861 first. And here at last, if you see the proprietor, is Mr. J. Lamass. So here's our Lamass, who allegedly found Carney singing in his tin shop and took him into the music hall stage. So the review says that the holiday folks have enjoyed at this establishment a new and comical pantomime from the pen of Mr. J. Carney, entitled King of the Cannibal Islands, or The Mendicant Fairy and the Enchanted Forest, which is well supported by the present company. Mr. W. Butler is an excellent clown, creating laughter in his comicalities. Mr. Loosemore seems quite at home as Pantaloon. Mr. Hayes improves as Harlequin, and Madame Akrama is a pleasing Columbine. The proprietor has not spared expense, and praise is due to the stage manager, Mr. W. Butler, for its production. The vocal department is as strong and efficient as ever. The Butler family and their champion dog, Nero, are still favourites. So this is from the Era, a kind of paper that did a lot of theatrical reviews in January the 6th, 1861, a review that appears to have been written by the Butler family. They're getting so much credit for there. And the pantomime was obviously a standard Harlequinade, very popular here too at the time, with all the stock characters, Pantaloon, Harlequin, Columbine, etc. The title is also a stock one, The King of the Cannibal Islands, which was a popular song at the time. The following year, the little note in the bottom, at the same time, around the Christmas time, January, Carney was playing the Demon King in another pantomime, but he doesn't get a writing credit on this one. So the knowledge that Carney wrote, or at least cobbled together, a pantomime that was warmly received over Christmas 1860 and through, sorry, lost my page, and through January 1861, because a note in the same newspaper on Sunday, January the 27th, states the pantomime is still successful. So it's just one more intriguing detail about this elusive figure. Just to give you an idea of the kind of establishments where Carney sang, one of them, Prince Patrick's, which we saw on the slide before, is dismissed in a magnificently bitchy and overblown response by one anonymous critic to a query. I perceive a party complains that I omit to notice the performance at some Dublin theatre. Your correspondent possibly alludes to an old fabric in the classic locality of Fishamble Street, to which it would appear the right to give dramatic representations still appertains. Until Prince Patrick's, or the Lyceum, or whatever I am to call this house, as it changes its name as often as any pickpocket, falls into the hands of someone who will repair it, as the Scotchman did his firearm when he gave it a new stock, lock and barrel, the performance there will not be worth reporting. So that's from the Players newspaper in May 1860. So from this imperious dismissal, it's clear that Carney worked in some of the least salubrious establishments of Dublin. Carney's songs were not only popular in Dublin, but many were printed at the Poet's Box and other places in Glasgow, including some of these examples. Both of these songs refer to Dublin street characters of the time who were friends of Carney's. Stony Pockets, about whom Carney wrote at least 4 songs, was an eccentric man who kept stones in his pockets to stop himself from floating away. Here his worldly goods are being sold off after he dies, and the Queen regrets him so that no duty she'll be charging, as the song says. And at Billy Barlow's wedding, Billy Barlow was another music hall performer. There's a fishmonger, Peg Mills, and her partner, Oni the Gom, or Oni the Fool, as he's sometimes called. Oni was partial to funerals and attended as many as he could, presumably getting some alms, food and drink for his trouble. And while on the subject of Glasgow, this ballad sheet from the Poet's Box has an introduction which tells us that the song was performed by Carney in the character of Oni, and also it's got a great, it creates a great idea of how valuable and exciting the songs of Carney are. They waited 6 years to publish this. This song was published in 1851, whereas it was published in Dublin in 1845. So the Poet's Box in Glasgow seemed very, very happy to get it. Daddy Oram was another street character in Dublin who always wore a big Macintosh which he'd been given by some benefactor, and so he wore that winter and summer. He was very vain, apparently. We don't know very much about him. So we've got the idea of the persona here of Carney being kind of a character actor when he's singing. And here's another reference to that from Zosimus' piece again by P.J. McCall, when he says that Zosimus was a power in the land and imitators spread up on every side to try and pretend that they were him. While on the stage, the late James Carney gave successful representations of him. So again, we've got this idea of a kind of a character actor. I think part of the reason there's a lot of confusion about Carney is because people were taken in by his characters. And so one of his songs, one of his signature songs, Mr. J. Carney's new song, Paudine Rua, or A Tinker's Travels, tells the story of a rambler going through Ireland, leaving his family home and going through Ireland. And perhaps this may be where the idea that he was like a traveller came from. Again, in his song, The Dublin Night Policeman, the third and fourth line there, straight from Limerick town I came and fakes my name is Jamesy Carney. So again, people think, okay, so this guy is from Limerick, but was he? We can't be sure. So looking at some of his songs, the best known of his songs is Courting in the Kitchen. I presume people know that song here. Come single bell and bow, unto me pay attention, don't ever fall in love, 'tis the devil's own invention, for once I fell in love with a lady so bewitching, she invited me to a hoolie in the kitchen with a torala, etc. Now, one of the interesting things about this song, it was published, these are two different versions in Glasgow. There's there's a version here published by Catmac in London, and it has different words to it, including it uses the word gammon. And it also has the young maid in question inviting the man in for tea and toast, which seems a very English thing. I think they were just drinking whiskey in the song. Another interesting thing about this is, as a child in Dublin in a primary school around 1970, I remembered this song as a street game, a circle game where the young woman in question was picking out her man from the outside circle, whirling him around dangerously in the middle, and then he would become the young lady and go and choose somebody, that typical kind of game. But we use that song, and I think that's very interesting, that a sort of a balladeer from the tenements in Dublin, one of his works became a street song. Another song, The Wedding Above in Glencree, a typical comic kind of wedding song. This song kind of languished in obscurity for many years, but was revived in the Goling Traditional Singing Club in Dublin by a man called Tony McGailey, who you'll hear about later, and by Mick Keeley, who still sings there. And from there it was picked up by Derry Farrell, who is one of the BBC Folk Award winners in the last couple of years, and it's the title track of his latest album released this year. So I think that's an interesting idea that Carney is becoming popular again, which is really good to see. We've looked at Stony Pocket's auction, so I just have that slide up, but you can see the really beautifully produced their version on the right hand side, and the songbook published by Duffy in 1845, which had 300 pages. It's really interesting, in Dublin, published by a Dublin printer, and it just shows the popularity of songbooks at the time to be able to sell that. And he produced it every year, but just the 1845 one has a lot of Carney in it. So there's a lot of disputed authorship about Carney's songs, particularly about one of the songs that he is credited with in several places, called St. Kevin and King O'Toole. And in a book called Irish Humour, DJ O'Donoghue has a note at the back about the authors, and he credits this song to Thomas Shalvey, a market gardener in Dublin who wrote some amusing poems for James Carney, a vocalist who used to sing at several music halls and inferior concert rooms in Dublin a good many years ago. Carney was very popular, and some of his best songs were written for him by Shalvey. An interesting little thing turned up in Harding's Dublin Songster, which was published around the turn of the 20th century. We're not exactly sure of the dates for this, but it was seemed to be published monthly and then kind of put together. You could put them together as kind of a book. In volume 2, issue 16, I think, of this, at the end of one of Carney, there's just one song credited to Carney in this, I think, and it's by memory inspired a really wonderful song, but I just wanted you to see the end. Born in Dublin, for many years a favourite singer in Crampton Court. So that's the only place I've ever seen that Carney was born in Dublin, but perhaps The song publisher in Dublin has a little more knowledge about Carney than other people who are writing about him. We know that Carney died, obviously, at some time. We don't know what the date of this song is, but it's a lament for Carney called Carney is No More. And it mentions about a dozen songs, many of them known Carney songs, but some tantalisingly lost, such as the Zoological Gardens. Now, there's a famous Dominic Behan song about the Zoological Gardens in Dublin, but it would be really great to find Carney's Zoological Gardens song, and I'm on the hunt for it. If anybody ever comes across one, let me know. So, P.J. McCall told us that Carney had died, or that the Sparling had said that Carney had died in about 12 years ago, which at the time would have meant around the early 1800s. P.J. McCall was quoting from this book, Irish Minstrelsy by Halliday Sparling, which was published in 1888, and I think it's a case of lazy copy and paste by McCall. He says, oh, your man said he died 12 years ago, but in fact it was 12 years ago from the date of Sparling's book, not from the date of McCall's paper, so that muddied the water a little bit more. So this suggested that Carney died in 1876. In a book called The Poets of Ireland, a biographical dictionary by David J. O'Donoghue, there's a little note about Carney, a popular singer in Dublin some 20 years ago or so. Now this is published in 1892, so that suggests Carney's around singing in the early 1870s. He wrote various songs which had a vogue, such as King O'Toole and St. Kevin, By Memory Inspired, etc., and emigrated to America. He's probably still living. So this is in 1892 to 3, and it would be great to think that he was still living. So I looked everywhere for Carney's death records. I couldn't find them anywhere, and in fact Irish records are very well digitised, birth, marriages and death records, but no trace of Carney could I find with any of these dates. Okay. Then I got an email from Tony McGailey, who is one of the men I had mentioned had sung Carney songs in the Golding Traditional Singing Club in Dublin. Hi Catherine, I see you've taken an interest in the songs of James Carney, 1822 to 1862, etc. So I immediately stopped in my tracks when I saw the hit Carney States. And this email goes on had lots and lots of other information on it. I did ask Tony, was it okay to share it today? He said it was. So I immediately wrote back to Tony and thanked him for his interest, and I asked him where he got his dates, because these are the only time I got the dates. And I just want to thank Tony for sharing his research from his unpublished manuscript, Who is James Carney, where he's collected a lot of songs, some of which I didn't have myself. Tony, in one of the exact same newspapers that I've been looking at, the Era newspaper, which had a mention of Carney in August, the last mention of him in August the 1st, 1862, noticed this. The death of James Carney, Irish comic singer and Hibernian poet, who departed this life on Saturday last, August the 16th in Dublin, that's 1862, after a career of 22 years in the profession and well known throughout England, Ireland and Scotland. All post office orders, stamps, monies forwarded to Dan Lowry, Malakoff Music Hall, Cleveland Square, Liverpool, in aid of the widow and orphans to butter in some little way of business as they are left in very low circumstances, will be thankfully received and forwarded to them by Dan Lowry. Now, Dan Lowry, I don't know if anybody's heard of him, but he had a music hall in Liverpool in the 1860s and maybe 50s as well. He eventually had a music hall in Dublin, which eventually became the Olympia Theatre, still standing today. And it's very interesting that he suggests that Carney is very well known in England and in Scotland, and we saw the Poets Box and we saw the Catnach publication, but it's just really tantalising to know, was Carney ever there? Did he ever go to England or to Glasgow? Did he ever go to Liverpool? There was a lot of back and forth between Ireland and Glasgow and Ireland and Liverpool at the time, in the late 1800s or the mid 1800s. So I'd be very intrigued if anybody has any access to archives in Liverpool and Glasgow, if you can ever come across anything from Dan Lowry, maybe bringing him over in some way. Now, because of getting this date, literally 2 weeks after Carney last performed in Dublin, Tony was able to find his burial record, which is different from his death record. We still haven't got that. And he was buried in a beautiful cemetery in Dublin, Golden Bridge Cemetery in Inchicore. It gives his date as his last address as 12 Peter's Row, which is, again, was a row of tenements near St. Patrick's Cathedral. And it also gives us the number of his grave, WW 33.5, with a little star. And it says there's 7 people buried in the same grave. And actually, Tony had, I didn't put them all up, but Tony had a record of the other 7 people. He wasn't sure they were related. One of them was his Carney's 6-month-old son, it would appear, but the rest we weren't sure if they were related. I went out to Golden Bridge Cemetery to try and track down the grave, but it was an unmarked grave, possibly was at the time also. And but I met a grave digger, and he told me that this was the spot where 33.5 WW 33.5 was. So it was nice to have a little spend a little time thinking about Carney there. Because I found his death record through Tony, I was able to find, I think, his birth record, and thanks to Harding's comic songster saying that he'd been born in Dublin, there is a James Carney who was born in the parish of St. James, the next parish over from Patrick's in Dublin, just near the Guinness Emporium, if anybody's ever been there, the Guinness Storehouse. And he gives his baptism date of October 1821. So that would make him exactly 40 when he died in August 1862. It doesn't really tell us very much, but it could be our man. So maybe after all, Carney was the raking, roving, travelling. Carney was a local all along. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Catherine. That was, I think, reflects, just the most incredibly, painstaking research, all those tiny, weeny sources and trying to fit them together, check them out against each other. It's, I think several of us in the room have probably done something similar and feel your pain. But it was fantastic to get such a deep insight into Carney and, how prolific he was. Any questions, comments? Anyone want to follow up on any of the points that Catherine was making, or have insights into how he may have maybe infiltrated this country, Liverpool or indeed in Glasgow? Does it resonate with anyone? John?
I mean, just a couple of points. One is that going back to the 1860s and possibly the 1850s, the legitimate theatres opened their doors to the dirty musical performance for pantomime. It was a tradition, so it was quite common. And Kearney being so famous really resonates. There's a number of Irish musical performers that have almost entirely disappeared from history and are responsible for significant parts of the Irish repertoire. Billy Ashcroft, W.J. Ashcroft, who wrote The Man You Don't Meet Every Day, is almost unknown. Yet at the time, he was described. They didn't even need to name him in adverts. He was just the solid man. The solid man is coming. And there was real links in the halls between Glasgow, Belfast, and Liverpool. There was a triangular trade, if that's not inappropriate, in performance. Because of the very big Irish community in Glasgow and Liverpool, where they would expect to see performance that they'd seen in Dublin.
Dan Lowry himself, by the way, was from Tipperary originally, and he made a succeed. He was originally a comic singer, apparently, and then he acquired some music halls. And he quite an empire then of music halls around Dublin, Belfast, and Liverpool. So.
Lowry is very often referred to as if we should all know who he is in the 19th century commentary on this stuff.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Sorry, I should have asked you to repeat.
Oh, sorry.
No, I was reminded. But any further points? Just one, yeah, over here.
Steve, it's more of a comment. I think it just shows still the serendipitous nature of research. There are people out there who have worked on what we are working on, who we don't know about, and they don't know about us. And I think it just shows the necessity for something like this, that we just come together to share our research, because that's the whole idea. When someone says, "Oh, you're working on X, what do you know about these set of papers?" I mean, I've been shown some letters recently by Anne Gilchrist. If I would have tried to figure out how this person had them, I would have got to them a little bit sooner. But I think the point is stuff is still out there. And I rather feel that what we also need to have in many ways possibly is what I could say is a register of lost collections. Stuff that we know is out there. I mentioned in a letter or something, a meta or something like that, such that we just have a finding is people could say, aha, this is what this is what someone is interested in.
Thank you. Yeah. Did most people hear that? So just about the importance of sharing research because people are working. I was very lucky because I posted, and I think that's a good thing, sharing my own research. I posted it online because I have a website, a very small website, only little bits of information on it. But I posted something on social media about it, and that's how Tony McGailey spotted that I was working on Carney and got in touch. So that was really serendipitous for me. It was wonderful because weirdly Carney does not feature in the Dublin papers, and that's why none of the Dublin writers were able to say when he died. It's really strange, and there's some mystery surrounding that, which I'll have to investigate. But it was an English paper, and it was Dan Lowry looking for funding for his widow and orphans who actually made the announcements of his death. It didn't seem to filter through in Dublin. I'm not really sure why that is.
Absolutely. Thank you so much again, Catherine. That was a great paper. So our final presentation for the morning is from Mike Borsnell. I'd like to welcome a molecular biologist by day. He comes to share, and I hope in an approachable way, his knowledge for us today. He's going to, I think, do you want some help on this? Yeah, just I can't speak and do the computer at the same time, so I'll do the introduction. Mike's actually going to apply this knowledge to sort of the genealogies of song. So it's really interesting, a subject that I think we've all sort of dabbled in, some more than others. But love to, it's absolutely addictive, isn't it? So let's just find you a PowerPoint. It is on here. There it is. Fantastic. And I'll start you off. Excellent. Over to you, and thank you, Mike, for coming.
Right, I have to work out which way to look. I think I'll look at this screen here. Okay, well, thanks for the organisers for inviting me to talk at this. It's my first folk music conference, so wish me luck. So I'll start off with just a bit of an introduction about myself, my credentials, so you'll know what to believe and what not to believe when I talk about them. So here, this is my day job here, or used to be before I retired, working as a scientist, slightly squished, but I'm not quite that fat. But so this was in a coronavirus lab in the 80s. We were working on coronavirus vaccines, strangely enough, and chopping out the spike from the coronavirus and things that you're all very familiar with these days. But I don't have any background in, like some of you here, in folk scholarship at all, so I'm only an amateur in that. So apologies if I tell you things that you already well know. But I have played in folk groups. Here we are, a folk group in the 1970s. There's me with my 12-pound bass guitar, doing Wife of Usher's Well, I think it looks like from this song. I've followed folk music ever since. I have a Fay-heeled tea towel, so must count for something. Okay, so what I thought was, could I combine the two of these things, and my knowledge about how to analyse DNA on the computer and my interest in the folk music. So one of the things that you do when you're studying viruses, for example, is to make family trees of how they're connected. You may have seen them with the coronavirus pandemic, trees of the various types of COVID. And you can do this from DNA. So if you've got something like here, you've got a collection of cats in the cat family. Just looking at them, you can't really tell which ones are most closely related to which other ones. If you take their DNA and run it through a simple sort of program, you get a nice family tree like this. And you can see how they're related. You can see, for example, okay, that's interesting. There's supposed to be a ring on that thing pointing out. I'll have to use my hand in that case. So you can see something like cougar is more closely related to a cheetah than it is to a tiger or something like that, and it sort of shows the relationships very nicely. So what I thought was, could you do the same thing with songs? So if you had a bunch of song texts like this here, could you put them through the same programs basically and draw a tree, a genealogy to show how all the songs were connected, and get something like this, you know, with different song versions showing which ones were most closely related and which ones weren't, for example. Do I need to talk louder? Yes. Okay. Am I talking too quietly? Who can hear me? Okay. Okay, I'll talk a bit louder, near the microphone. So Cecil Sharp was he put his finger on it when he said that the development and history of a folk song was clearly a case of evolution. And if he was around today and knew about DNA and things like that we know these days, he was also, I'm sure, spotted loads of other really striking parallels between the evolution of DNA and the evolution of folk songs. So what I'm going to try and do is make a song tree from different versions of a single folk song, see how they're related. This is not different folk songs, it's the same folk song. So I chose Barbara Allen, why not? Lots of versions of Barbara Allen. And so I wouldn't bias my selection of songs, I decided to use a single source, so the Vaughan Williams Memorial Library. And I had various other criteria. They had to have the text transcription, the location and the date, and a singer. In other words, that they were orally transmitted or orally sung anyway. So going through the database, that ended up with 55 versions of Barbara Allen, for which I was trying to find a way of connecting these all together. So just a quick section here about how it works, very quick. So you just start with a sentence like this, young man on his deathbed lay, and then you just simply translate each word into a unique 3-letter code like this here. So young becomes NTK, for example, or something. And when you squash those letters together, you get something which is amino acid sequence, basically, and that's what you can put it straight through these programs without changing anything at all. So you plug it into a program online, freely available websites that anybody can use, just paste something in, click a button, and you get a song tree at the end. So that's quite good. So let's have a look at the results. You know, did it all work? So here's a tree. You can't really read the text, but that doesn't particularly matter for the demonstration. So you get a tree like this, and I'll just explain a little bit about how these work, so you can see how they work, basically. So time moves from left to right on the tree. So the song versions on the right, with the small text you can't really read, they're the current versions of the song. They're at the tips of the tree, if you like. And they're the current versions in, you know, they were collected in the beginning of the 20th century mostly. And then on the left-hand side of the diagram are the old versions, which we don't have anymore. They've vanished in the mists of time. You know, they're sort of like saber-toothed tigers or something like that. And then these points here, these green dots mark a few branch points. So what a branch point is where somebody sings a song to somebody else, and they change it very slightly, and then you get 2 songs at that point, and they go off, and each of those can change into 2 songs more, and that's where you get the tree shape like this here. So we've got a nice picture of a tree, but somebody once said phylogenetics, which is the name for this sort of process, is beautifully dangerous, and that's very true actually, because you can get a nice tree, and it looks great, and you print it out, and you think, oh, that looks lovely, but it could be completely rubbish. It might not mean anything at all. You know, you could make a tree out of the shoe sizes of folk singers or something like that. And, you know, and it would look great, but it wouldn't mean anything at all. So you need some sort of reality check on this whole thing. So let's see if we can do that. One thing that you can use, and probably the best thing, is associated information. So it's information that's associated with the song, but not in the song. So let's try looking at some of those, like the location where it was collected. So you'd expect versions of a song collected in the same country should show relatedness on the tree if the tree is working. So, you know, if you sing a song in Sussex or something, you'd expect somebody else nearby to learn it, and rather than somebody in Australia or you know, West Virginia or something like that. So let's have a look at that, see if that works. So here's the tree again. And if you look, you can see there's sort of three main groups here, which I've just marked with a bracket, just to sort of guide you around the tree. So there's like a big group at the bottom, medium-sized group in the middle, and a small group at the top. So let's look at this group at the bottom. Where do they come from? Well, they're all from USA, interestingly, and that's really encouraging, because it means, you know, you've got something on the tree, the textual relatedness has brought them together on the tree, and the geographical relatedness is also together on the tree. So that suggests that it's you know, it really does have some meaning, this arrangement of songs. So that's good. So the middle group, again, this has worked quite well. These are all UK songs. So again, you've got another really tight cluster of songs, which they're all UK songs, and they're all together on the tree as well. And then there's a small group at the top, which are different. They're a mixture of the UK and USA songs. So I'll come back to that later to try and tease out what's going on there. So that's quite encouraging, I thought, when I found that results. So that dot there is the earliest common ancestor of all the USA songs. Just in this group of 55 songs, I mean. You know, so that's a sort of, you know, an early song which has given rise to that whole group. But, you know, we don't have that anymore. Of course, it's vanished. So the other thing you can look at are story variants. So just a quick recap on the story. Most people will know it, but there's a young man on his deathbed, and he's sometimes a young man, he's sometimes William, he's sometimes Johnny, he's got various names. So here he is on his bed, feeling ill in his bedroom. He rings up his girlfriend, she comes round, and she's not, well, quite frankly, she's not very sympathetic at all. So, and then he says, well, look, I've got this basin of blood at the bottom of my bed. Doesn't that make you feel sorry for me? And she says, no. She says, what were you doing in the tavern last week, drinking with all the girls, and you never drank a toast to me? And then she goes off, and he dies, and then she sees his body coming over the fields, and she looks at it, and then, she bursts out laughing. It's one of the most chilling scenes in any folk song, I think. And then she goes off and she dies, and they're both buried in the churchyard. So there are lots of different variants in this song, but they're not always in each song. So, like, it might not have the basin variant, it might not have the tavern variant, it might not have the laughing variant. So we can look at those on the tree, if the graphic works okay. So let's look at the name of the boy. So here's the tree again. Let's plot some names of the boy on the tree. So first one, we can put William on, and that's a good correlation there between the songs that have the word William in and the songs that are in the USA. So if you look, that's the text of the song on the left-hand side, and the three red blobs are the word William. So William only takes up to 1% of the whole song, so it doesn't affect where it is on the tree. You know, if you I've tried changing the name William to, you know, Nigel or something like that, and it doesn't affect where it is on the tree. So so that's a really meaningful correlation. And then here are the other names of the boy, and again they're all nicely grouped in little groups, which is quite good. They're not just scattered, you know, willy-nilly all over the tree. So again, that serves to validate the tree and to suggest that it does have some meaning. So let's look at the other story variants. So there's the tavern. So there are the tavern songs. So mostly in the USA, a couple in the UK group, and a few at the top. So That's interesting. So the laughing variant is only in the UK in these 55 songs. So I don't know why that is. You know, maybe the American audiences just found it too distasteful and it was dropped out. Who knows? But that's a very dramatic correlation, I think. So that was just to say, you know, why aren't there any laughing songs in America? So the basin variant, again, it's only the UK songs in this group. So if you look at that, it's not all the UK songs, it's just some of them. So the way you can think of this in terms of how the information flows through the tree is that's the original basin variant, basin version. And what's happened is at various points in the tree, marked by these sort of grey circles, then the singer may have just dropped that verse. They might have decided, you know, it didn't go down well with the audience, or they didn't like singing about blood in basins, you know, quite understandable. And that's dropped out, and that's why you haven't got the basin in all versions that we see today. So, yes, I think something's missing here. Yeah, there is. Okay, there's supposed to be a red circle around that group at the top, but that doesn't matter. So the top group is the UK and USA songs. They're all mixed up together, and you know, that doesn't fit in with a nice separation at the bottom. So I'm going to just look at that top group and see if I can work out why it's mixed like that. So here it is zoomed in a bit more closely, and the red ones are the UK ones, and the blue ones are the USA ones. And if you look at just those bottom two, there's a song from Kent and a song from Georgia in the States. They're collected by different collectors at slightly different times, so it wasn't, you know, one collector who mixed up their pages in their notebook or anything. But they're very, very similar, and even though they're separated by thousands of miles. So, you know, there's a couple of obvious reasons for that. One could be that the person who sang the song in Kent and then taught it to somebody who emigrated to the States. You know, there are a lot of people emigrating to the States at this sort of time. And then this person ended up in Georgia, and then they sang it to a collector in Georgia, and that's why the two songs are very similar. And you know, that logically perfectly makes sense. It's possibly slightly unlikely, and it's possibly it's not. You can't really prove it, so you just have to leave that thought hanging in the air, really. The other obvious possibility is that the people on the opposite sides of the Atlantic both saw the same printed version of the song, either in a book or in a broadside or something. So I haven't talked about non-oral versions, printed versions at all, so I'll just do a little bit about that now and ask the question, where do they fit on this tree that I've drawn? So here's the tree again, with the USA at the bottom, the UK group in the middle, and the mixed group at the top. And down the left-hand side, there's 22 printed versions that I've found, dug out, books and broadsides. And what I'm going to do is just plonk those on the tree closest to the songs that they are most related to, if that's a real sentence. So the top two on the list on the left match most closely to those 4 songs in that little group at the top there on the right. And then I just do the same for all the others, and that's where they match on the tree. So you can see straight away that it's not an even distribution at all. There are a lot more printed versions mapping onto that top group, the mixed group. And in fact, if you look at the numbers, it's 10 times as many per song. So what that means to me is that the reason why these songs are so closely related in this group, and the UK ones and the USA ones mixed up together, is because they're all related to printed versions. So that's a sort of interesting thing that you can, you know, tease out of a tree like this. So right, nearly finished now, and then you can have your lunch. Conclusions. So what I wanted to sort of address was whether the song trees are meaningful, and whether they're interesting, and whether they're useful. That's probably the most difficult question. So I think the fact that the very non-random grouping of the American songs and the UK songs and the match to the printed versions of things, I think it does suggest that the songs the song trees do have some sort of meaning, and it ties in with their actual connectedness, textual connectedness. Are they interesting? I mean, I asked somebody about this, and they said they'd be interested to see where Irish versions fitted on the tree. And you could, that sort of question you could ask, you could say something like, where does Martin Carthy's version of the song fit on the tree, or where does Harry Cox's 1969 version fit on the tree? So I've just to try answering that, I took a couple of Irish versions, one from the north and one from the south, and put them on the tree. And they're right at the top there, if you can see, on that green line, it says Irish version. So that is interesting. I think they map completely separate from all the other groups of the tree. And so, I'm thinking, oh, that's interesting. I'll go on and do a few more Irish versions later on and see where they all fit in. So that's the question of, are they interesting? Are they useful? Now, this is much more difficult, really. They might be just a fun thing to look at. I mean, people have used this sort of analysis to look at old documents, different scribal versions of old documents, and I think people were a bit resistant to it to start with, but they found it actually is really useful, and it ties up very closely with the results from sort of the more traditional scholastic study. So people are beginning to accept it's a good way of looking at collections of documents like that. Another thing possibly might be useful for, if you're writing an article, say, about Barbara Allen, you could make evidence-based statements about the relationships between the songs. So you could say something like, more than 80% of the American versions of Barbara Allen form a single group with no UK versions, or something, not necessarily that, but some sort of evidence-based statement about how the songs were connected. But for me, maybe the most useful thing, perhaps, is just that you get a nice bird's-eye view of the whole sort of song, the whole different versions of the song. You can see here that the laughing versions cluster very nicely around the UK versions. And you could do that on a spreadsheet, or obviously if you knew the songs very well, like the back of your hand, you'd know that anyway, but just to demonstrate it or put it in an article or something, I think it's quite nice to be able to get that sort of bird's eye view of the whole thing. So, useful? Who knows? Over to you, perhaps. So, there you go.
Thank you so much, Mike. I thought I was going to not manage, but you managed to put it so clearly. I've actually kept up. That was amazing. It raises, for me, just a million questions, but it is fascinating as well. And the allure of that neat chart is, I've done this on pieces of paper all over the floor for my PhD thesis, and it's, drives you mad. And the more song variants you've got, the harder it is, isn't it? So I think just from that point you made about the visualization value of it, I think that's just sorting it out. But that's me talking, and actually what I want to do is really, I think we do have a few minutes before lunch, to open the floor in case anyone else is full of questions as well. I see hands shooting up, so we'll start with John.
Two quick questions. One, how laborious is the process of coding the lyrics? Once you've done it on one song, how long does it take you to then do another version? And then the second quick question was, will the software ever map the song not to the far right? Like, would it ever say, oh, this is definitely an ancestor of these two, and place it further to the left?
Okay,
so can you repeat the question?
Yeah,
Sorry,
okay.
yeah.
So the first question John was asking was just, how easy is it to do this translation of the text of the song into the codes? And I've just written a program to do that, so you just have to click a button sort of thing. So that's all sort of automated. I mean, the thing that takes the longest actually is just transcribing the songs from the screen from the website sort of thing. That takes the longest. But once you've done that, it's fairly easy to do the rest. And I want it to be a thing that other people would do. There's no point doing something if it's just too difficult for non-computery people to do it. So the other question about the position, yes, I mean you can do that. You can. There's this thing on the web which is called Next Strain, which was developed for tracking COVID variants. And with the COVID variants, you put in all the date where it appeared and the country it appeared, and it tracks it using the dates. And so that you'll have a tree with some branches, November go this far, and then the August branches don't go as far, just like you were saying. So you can do that. I mean, the problem, with the virus, you sort of know which date it was first seen. But with the song, although it was collected in 1910, the person might have learned it in 1860 or something. So it's a little bit, but it is quite fun playing around with this Next Strain site because it shows the sort of songs like moving across the country, with little red dots, which is very exciting. Which I don't know if that means anything or not.
Thank you. Some questions. Okay, over here first, and then we'll come to your
Very interesting talk. I'm interested in knowing how much the software could spot things that are related but not word by word. So if you swapped two verses in the transcription, would those two versions count as completely different? Whereas a human reader might look at it and think, oh well, those two verses just got swapped. They're still very closely related. Or would that count as a complete mismatch? And then the other question is, if spellings differ, that could be just a work of the collector or the century it was collected or whatever. Again, would they count as US hyphen D, US apostrophe D count as a completely different word from USED? Or is there enough flexibility to spot a relationship?
Okay, yes, both really good questions. The second one is easy to answer. So the text, I regularise the text beforehand. That's the sort of word that they use in that thing. So or if it says can't, I'll change it to cannot. And that's done automatically. So all those things are ironed out to start with. So for example, like Scottish versions of words would be changed to an English version. So that covers that. The other thing about things flipping around, different verses in different places, what I'm sort of relying on here is the fact that these programs have been designed to look at the evolution or evolving DNA sequences. And DNA sequences do all those sort of things all the time. They're exactly the same as songs. You get deleted bits, deleted genes, like deleted verses. You get things flip round, verses change, genes move different places. You get when you get sort of wandering verses coming in from other songs. You get transposons coming in from outside and sticking themselves in the middle of the DNA. Everything that songs do, DNA does as well. So I'm sort of relying on the fact that they work really well for DNA, that they work really well for the songs.
Paul?
Yeah, my point is really about the usefulness question, and I think one of the reasons why this kind of classification exercise works well and seems useful in folk music is that there's a reasonable degree of consensus about what the significant variables are. So variation in a text, I think, is something which most people who are seriously interested in folk music are interested in. So therefore, if you use text variation as one of your checking mechanisms, then that seems to be useful. It seems to have some kind of meaning because there is a consensus that that's the kind of thing we're interested in. Whereas if you compare it to other forms of machine classification of music, particularly around genre, which there's a lot of work in computer science, I understand, around genre, because of things like Spotify algorithms. There's money in this if we can identify similarities. The problem with that is that there's not as much consensus about what's significant, because there are set definitions about genre. Whereas I think with folk music, we know that we're interested in variation, and therefore, for this subject matter, it's useful.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I mean, when you set up sort of computery systems to compare music, you know, you probably have to make lots of decisions about how it's done. Whereas I'm trying to make this as sort of agnostic as possible, you know, just something, a very simple transformation, and then look at that, you know, so you're not putting your values on anything at all, you know. I'm sure that was a clear answer, wasn't it?
Yes, I think the music one is the one that I would be interested in if I could butt in, for obvious reasons, those of you who know me, and how that, you know, intersects, explains, blows out of the water some of those things. I mean, it might, for example, support some of your findings to do with the broadsides across the Atlantic. You'd expect maybe a song learned for a broadside in the US is going to have new tune fit to it, so compared to the way it's sung here. So you would expect, you know, that might support one of your findings, that, you know, those similarities are based on broadsides. But also there is this whole thing, I think you're alluding to, Paul, that we can none of us really agree what constitutes the same tune and what isn't, and how far a tune has to vary before it becomes another tune. And it doesn't have a sort of a narrative structure in quite the same way, obviously, as
you could do it. I mean, I think people have done something like this with songs. You could do it. The reason I didn't tackle it is I sort of felt that, you know, when somebody learns a song and learns a new tune, I think they feel they have much more freedom to slightly change it than they do with the words. I would have thought, you know. And so, but that's actually my gut feeling.
So you're saying it's more variable than, or potentially so. Yeah, this is the thing, though, isn't it? We know that tradition is characterised by some tunes that are incredibly sort of stable, and attach themselves to songs, you know, sort of the same text, you know, very neatly and consistently over all kinds of space and time. And then other texts seem to have a gazillion different tunes. So
But I bet, if you heard 10 people sing The Sound of Silence or something, they'd all sing the same words, but I bet they would all sing the same tune.
I don't know if they got the LP.
Well, there will be subtle variations, you know, things changing.
Any more points before John?
Sorry, I wasn't going to come in, but I wanted to say it'd be interesting to test Steve Garden's theory that the less versions of songs are particularly influential in spreading folk songs, because we have a stable version of the less version of Barbara Allen from 1855, which was written about 7 years previously by Horatio, had already performed in Scottish theatre. It's a laughing Johnny version. That makes sense. It'd be interesting to see. You may have already done it.
No, I haven't. No. Yeah, that would be. Yeah, I can talk to you about that.
But it'd be interesting to test it and see whether it turns out that in England, for example, the Blessed version wasn't particularly influential. It'd be interesting if it said it wasn't.
Did you say that you'd done the same process to the Wife of Ush as well?
No, I haven't, no. I mean, I thought the next thing I thought would be worthwhile doing would be to try and find, and maybe you can help me on this, so that you try and find a song that somebody had done this sort of analysis with, using sort of, just traditional scholarship and looking at the text and things like that. And then saying, run this through and see if the same conclusions were drawn. But I haven't really found anywhere that, there's an Anne Gilchrist one about a land kit, but he doesn't really talk terribly clearly about how they're related, so I don't know. Is there anywhere like that?
I would have an idea, but David, I'm just going to make sure. So John's the last comment.
Eleanor Long has done that for Made Free from the Gallows.
Eleanor Long's study of the Made Free from the Gallows.
Oh, okay.
Is one. Yeah, and to some extent I was thinking Bronson as well.
Tables and well.
Okay, that sounds good.
How convincing I find it, but she certainly shows that if American ones are different from other ones, which is really not well shattering news. There you go. That would be a thing.
Yeah, that'd be fun to try.
It's getting very cooperative here. Sorry, this is the one last question, and I'm absolutely going to cut it. So no more hands.
About a song that has had some kind of family tree analysis. There's a lovely paper by Bertrand Bronson called Family Tree of Sam Hall. And Sam Hall because it had a very distinctive stanza pattern, you can see its progression right back, and he goes a long, long way back. And because it has this distinctive pattern, I think he says it's almost the only song that would be able to be analysed that way.
Yeah.
But it's a fascinating thing.
Oh, okay. Good. I'll try that then, yeah.
Bronson, an early pioneer, of course, of computerised approach to this, you know, from something like the 50s, punch cards and stuff. So. Fantastic. Thank you so much for such a provocative and interesting paper.